Lieutenant Brody Kane stepped down from the witness stand, walked past the bar as if the rules no longer applied to him, and without a breath of hesitation, slapped Judge Darius Hale across the face. The sound cracked across courtroom 3 like a snapped branch. Gasps cut through the air. Pens dropped. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. Kane did not apologize. He did not flinch. He simply stared at the judge with a cold steadiness that told the entire room this was not a loss of control. This was a message. Judge Darius Hale turned his face back toward the light, his cheek already burning red, and said in a calm voice that unsettled everyone, "Let the record reflect exactly what just occurred." That was the moment the room understood. Whatever line had existed between law and violence had just been erased by the man wearing the badge. Before diving into this story, tell me where you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and give me a like. Judge Darius Hale kept his voice steady, the way he always did when someone tried to intimidate him. He touched the corner of his mouth, felt the blood gathering there, and then lowered his hand. "Proceed," he said. Those who knew him understood what that single word meant. He would not recess. He would not leave the bench. He would not give Kane the satisfaction of a pause. He looked to the clerk. "Call the next matter." The courtroom remained frozen in shock, but the judge's tone pulled everyone back into their seats, as if refusing to let chaos take root. Moments earlier, the hearing had opened like any other. The defendant, a 17-year-old boy named Isaiah Reyes, stood at the table with his public defender, looking smaller than any boy should look inside a courtroom. He was charged with refusing orders during a stop on the west side. No weapon, no assault, no threat. Just a teenager who looked an officer in the eye and didn't move fast enough to satisfy him. Judge Hale had read the file twice that morning. Something about it bothered him. Something beneath the surface of the carefully typed statements. He had seen that pattern before. Kane had testified with his usual confidence, boots polished, shoulders squared, voice clipped and sure. When Hale asked, "What made you fear for your safety?" Kane didn't hesitate. "The look in his eyes, Your Honor. On the west side, a look can end you." It wasn't the words that unsettled the room. It was the ease with which he said them, as if they were truth beyond challenge. Hale allowed a measured pause. He wrote one line in his small notebook, the one he carried into every hearing. No one knew what he wrote. Some said it was his shield. Others said it was his reminder not to lose himself. Lena Vargas, seated in the press row, felt her stomach tighten. She had covered enough hearings to recognize when something beneath the surface was starting to shift. It was the way Kane sat too comfortably in the witness chair, the way his answers came without the slightest hint of doubt, the way he used the phrase, "men like him," in interviews when he thought no one was listening. She angled her recorder toward him and let it run. Theo Ramirez, Judge Hale's law clerk, watched every detail from his small desk behind the bench. His pen tapped gently against the yellow pad in front of him, a nervous habit he never quite shook. Theo believed in the law with a kind of reverence, the way some people believe in prayer. But Kane made that faith harder. Kane got promoted too fast. Kane's reports always matched perfectly, almost unnaturally. Theo had seen his father destroyed by one altered report years ago, a lie he refused to sign, and a truth that eventually crushed him. Theo watched Kane carefully, the way someone watches a shadow in the corner of their room. After finishing his testimony, Kane stepped down from the stand. He moved past the defense table, past the clerk, past the bar, and paused beside the bench. There was a moment, half a second, when the room seemed to hold its breath. Kane leaned just slightly toward the judge and whispered, "You sit too high for a man who doesn't know what the streets owe us." Hale heard it. So did the microphone. It was quiet, but the tone carried something sharp enough to draw blood. Hale looked at him, not as a judge looking at an officer, but as a man recognizing a threat that had finally spoken its own name. Before he could respond, Kane lifted his hand. What happened next felt unreal, even as it unfolded. The lieutenant struck him, open palm, full force, a blow delivered with the confidence of someone who believed no consequence would ever touch him. The crack of the slap silenced the gallery. Even the cameras seemed to stop humming. Lena stood halfway out of her seat, her breath locked in her chest. The recorder caught every sound. Theo froze, pen pressed into the page, hard enough to tear it. Isaiah Reyes stared with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that if a judge wasn't safe in this room, none of them were. Judge Hale straightened his spine. His cheek throbbed, the sting spreading like heat beneath the skin. But his voice remained calm. "Let the record reflect the actions of Lieutenant Kane." He didn't blink. He didn't raise a hand to his face again. He simply picked up the next file. "We will proceed. Call the next matter." People in the gallery looked at one another, waiting for someone to shout, for security to storm forward, for the judge to leave the bench, for the world to behave the way it should. But Hale was already turning the page. He would not let Kane define the moment. The rest of the docket moved under a blanket of silence. No one spoke above a whisper. No one shifted in their seats. Every ruling felt heavier than the one before it. And yet Judge Hale never wavered. His cheek burned, his jaw ached, but his posture remained steady. When the final case closed, he rose from the bench, nodded to Theo, and said softly, "Send me the draft order this afternoon." Kane walked out of courtroom 3 without looking back. Lena stayed seated, replaying the moment in her mind, feeling the ground beneath Port Augustine tilt with a slow, terrible certainty. She didn't know it yet, but the flash drive that would arrive at her apartment door later that night, the one that would expose a large number of altered police reports, had already been set in motion the moment Kane's hand met the judge's face. That open-handed slap did more than bruise a man. It cracked open a city, and everyone in that room felt the first fracture. Weeks later, the moment arrived, without warning, without temperature, without the faint rustle of tension that usually announces danger. It came in the middle of an ordinary hearing, during an ordinary question, in the same courtroom where Judge Darius Hale had tried to convince himself that the slap weeks earlier was a moment of madness, not a declaration of war. The case before him involved a 15-year-old boy with a cast on his right arm, a child small enough that his feet barely touched the floor when he sat in the witness chair. His wrist had been broken during what the officer on scene described as standard restraint. Hale asked the same question he had asked 100 times in 100 hearings. "Lieutenant Kane," he said, his voice calm and paced, "can you explain the exact circumstances that led to this child's injury?" He expected a defensive answer. He expected deflection. He expected Kane's familiar tight smile. What he did not expect was what happened next. Kane rose slowly from the witness chair, nodding as if he were preparing to give detailed testimony. But instead of turning toward the bench or toward the gallery, he walked past the clerk's desk, past the defense table, and crossed the bar with long, deliberate step that sent a tremor through the room. Judge Hale set his pen down. "Lieutenant, return to your seat," he said. Kane did not. He kept walking until he stood in front of the bench, eyes locked on the judge, like a man stepping into a personal vendetta he'd rehearsed for years. In the split second before it happened, Lena Vargas felt the air shift again. That same tilt in the floor she had felt weeks earlier, but this time sharper, heavier, unmistakable. She reached for her recorder. Theo Ramirez stood behind the judge's chair, his breath caught halfway in his chest. Before anyone could act, before a bailiff could move, before the judge could finish a sentence, Kane lifted his arm and slapped Judge Darius Hale full across the face, harder than he had the first time. A blow fueled not by impulse, but by certainty. The sound cracked like a shot. Hale's head jerked to the side. 5 bright, perfect fingerprints burned into his cheek. The bailiffs froze, stunned by the impossibility of the moment. The gallery screamed, a raw, frightened sound that seemed to vibrate against the walls. A woman clutched her chest. Someone whispered, "Dear God." Theo felt his vision narrow as shock flooded through him. Lena felt her throat close. She had planned to write a story about bias in police reports. She hadn't expected to witness a uniformed lieutenant striking a sitting judge twice in less than a month. And this time, it wasn't in the shadows or in a passing moment. It was on camera. It was in front of every living soul in courtroom 3. It was an act of open defiance, a challenge, a reckoning Kane seemed eager to ignite. Judge Hale did not fall. He did not stagger. He did not raise a hand to defend himself or wipe away the blood gathering at the corner of his mouth. He straightened slowly like a man standing up inside his own body, reclaiming something no one could take from him. The room expected outrage. They expected him to shout for security, call for an arrest, end the hearing, or retreat. Instead, his voice came low and steady, pulling the room back to stillness. "Let the record reflect exactly what happened," he said. His tone carried a weight deeper than anger. It carried conviction, principle, and years of restraint forged through every injustice he had ever navigated as a black judge in a city that still didn't know what to make of him. He looked toward the cameras. Keep them rolling. The reporters, stunned moments before, now scrambled to adjust equipment, realizing the gravity of what they were capturing. Kane stood firm, breathing evenly, his expression betraying no regret. Hale turned a page in his notebook. Even though his hands trembled slightly, he refused to recess. He refused to acknowledge the pain spreading across his cheek. He refused to let Kane define the moment. "We will continue," he said to the clerk. "Call the next matter." The courtroom stared at him in disbelief. Even the child whose arm had been broken looked confused, as if wondering why the adult who protected everyone else was choosing to stand unprotected now. But Hale wasn't refusing help. He was refusing surrender. He knew the cameras mattered. He knew the public record mattered most of all. He knew that stepping down would give Kane exactly the story he wanted. A story about a weak judge who couldn't withstand pressure. Hale's refusal was not pride. It was strategy. For the remaining hearings, the courtroom lived inside an unreal silence. Every motion, every objection, every ruling felt suspended in a kind of Emotional vacuum. Kane remained in the room, escorted to a corner seat by a bailiff who kept glancing nervously between him and the judge. Hale continued reading case summaries, as though the skin on his cheek weren't on fire. He paused once to take a breath, not from weakness, but from the weight of what rested on his shoulders. The weight of every child like Isaiah Reyes, every boy like the 15-year-old sitting with a cast, every name buried inside reports that never told the truth. Theo watched him closely, realizing the judge was holding the entire courtroom steady by sheer will. Lena wrote notes with her hand shaking, her recorder capturing not just words, but the subdued breaths, the restless shifting of bodies, the quiet horror settling across the gallery. She understood something now that she hadn't before. Kane wasn't just a violent man. He was protected, emboldened. He slapped a judge twice because he believed nothing could touch him. And if that belief were true, then something was deeply wrong in the city she had spent her career trying to expose. When the final case ended, Judge Hale closed his notebook with a gentle, almost reverent motion, as if sealing the moment inside. "Court is adjourned," he said. No one stood. No one moved. It took a long moment before the room remembered how to breathe. As Hale stepped down from the bench, Kane watched him with a gaze that made the hair rise on the back of Theo's neck. It wasn't satisfaction. It wasn't victory. It was promise. A grim, unspoken promise of what would come next. Hale walked past Kane without hesitation. The bailiffs finally found their footing, escorting the lieutenant through a side door. Lena remained seated, her recorder still glowing red. She didn't know who would send her the flash drive later that night, the one with many altered reports. But she knew the sender had chosen the right moment. The city was cracking open, and someone wanted her to see As Judge Hale stepped into his chambers, his cheek still blazing with Kane's fingerprints, the courthouse felt different, quieter, heavier, aware. The people of Port Augustin did not yet know it, but the second slap had opened a wound that would not close. It had also opened a door, and the truth waiting behind that door would reveal just how deep the darkness ran. That night, long after courtroom 3 had emptied and the echo of Kane's slap still lived in the walls, a plain white envelope slid under Lena Vargas's apartment door without a knock, without footsteps, without the faintest shadow to suggest who delivered it. She found it on the floor when she returned from the hospital interviews, exhausted, still replaying the image of Judge Hale, completing the remaining hearings with a handprint blazing across his cheek. The envelope had no name, no mark, just her address typed in clean black ink. She opened it with a slow, cautious motion. The way someone opens a letter they sense will change everything they understand about the world they live in. Inside was a single flash drive, light as air and terrifying in its silence. There was also a note, handwritten, in a tight, careful script. Start with the oldest. They never expected anyone to look back. No signature, no instructions, no threat. Only an invitation to truth delivered by someone who had just placed their faith and possibly their life in her hands. Lena set the recorder on her desk, plugged the flash drive into her laptop, and waited. A folder appeared. Inside it, she found a list of files so long it filled her entire screen. Many incident reports spanning nearly a decade, each one stamped, final, approved. Each one bearing the names Kane and Keller. She opened the first. It read like routine police paperwork. An altercation, a suspect resisting, a justified use of force. But when she scrolled to the bottom, she found an attachment labeled Original. She clicked it. The difference hit her like a physical blow. The original report stated clearly, subject compliant, no signs of aggression, minimal risk. The approved version said, subject exhibited hostile demeanor, required immediate restraint. She opened the second report, then the third. Then the fourth. With each click, a pattern emerged. Neat, deliberate, unmistakable. Words shifted. Descriptions hardened. Compliant became resistant. Calm became aggressive. Injured became threatening. Lena pressed her hands against her face and exhaled a quiet, shaky breath. Someone had been rewriting reality one sentence at a time, one life at a time, and the city had accepted every page as truth. Across town, in the courthouse basement where old files slept under layers of dust and neglect, Theo Ramirez was still working. It was late into the night. His pen tapped beside him, steady and rhythmic, the familiar pulse of a mind trying to stay calm while wrestling with something too heavy for its age. After the second slap, he had gone downstairs, searching for the original file of the 15-year-old boy whose wrist Kane claimed had been broken during standard restraint. But as he searched, he pulled a box labeled Cole D. Something inside him tightened. Cole wasn't an uncommon name, but the note on the side, closed on review, sent a cold flicker through his memory. He pulled the file out and opened it slowly. Darius Cole, 16, restrained during a stop, declared dead on scene. It was a case that had once shaken the West Side briefly before the city wrapped it in bureaucracy and silence. The official report claimed the boy attacked an officer. Theo read that sentence twice, his throat tightening. Then he saw a page clipped beneath it, thin, almost hidden. "Original draft," it said in faded letters. The words inside told a different story. Subject compliant. No resistance observed. Theo felt something break open in his chest. He saw his father's hands trembling. The night he refused to sign an altered report. He saw his father a week later, sitting silent at the kitchen table, with his badge turned upside down. He saw him the night he found him in the garage, unable to carry the weight anymore. Theo closed his eyes and swallowed hard. The truth wasn't just wrong, it was personal. He laid the two versions of the report side by side. The differences were subtle, but devastating. A single line changed the meaning of an entire life. One altered sentence had erased a child's innocence and replaced it with something dark enough to justify a death the city chose not to question. He felt anger rise through him, slow, heavy, steady. The kind of anger that didn't scream, the kind that stayed with you, the kind that turned into purpose. He copied the original pages and placed them gently into a folder, afraid to damage the paper, even though it already felt like it had been damaged by far greater hands. Meanwhile, Lena kept digging through the flash drive. She opened report after report. Story after story blurred into the same grim pattern. Injured suspects described as violent aggressors, quiet teenagers labeled threats. Minor incidents escalated into narratives that justified force, justified broken bones, justified bruised faces and shattered wrists. It wasn't sloppiness. It wasn't error. It was architecture. Constructed, repeated, perfected. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips as she typed notes. Each click of the keys a reminder that someone trusted her enough to share the truth the city had buried. She stopped when she reached the file labeled Cole Darius. Her breath caught. She opened it, scanning the altered version before clicking the original attachment. The same shift, the same quiet falsification. A child turned into a monster on paper, so the city would accept his death without question. She sat back in her chair, her hand drifting to her stomach in a reflex she hadn't yet admitted to anyone. She closed her eyes. She thought of the baby she had lost weeks earlier after the car rammed into her on a dark road, a loss she still carried in silence. And she thought of Darius, a boy whose mother had buried him, believing a lie the city had fed her. Lena whispered softly, "Not again. Not another child." The room felt too small, too quiet for the weight of what she held in her hands. In the basement, Theo gathered every page of the Cole file, each sheet trembling slightly between his fingers. He carried them upstairs, walking the long hallway toward chambers with a mix of dread and resolve. He knocked gently. Judge Hale opened the door, still wearing his robe, his cheek bruised and darkening. Theo hesitated, then placed the file on the desk. "You need to see this," he said softly. Hale opened the pages, his face tightening with each line he read. When he reached the last page, the original statement that had been buried, he closed his eyes. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. Theo answered in a thin, steady voice. "Longer than we ever knew. Across the city." Lena pressed save on the folder of stolen truth and leaned back in her chair. She didn't know who had sent her the flash drive. She didn't know why they trusted her. But she knew what it meant. Someone inside the system was ready to break the silence, and someone else, someone with power, was willing to kill that truth before it reached daylight. The files weren't just evidence. They were a map leading straight into the heart of the darkness Kane and Keller had built. And tonight, for the first time in nearly a decade, that darkness had begun to crack. The meeting happened in the kind of place where men went when they didn't want their voices to echo. The evidence garage behind the Special Response Unit sat dark and hollow, lit only by a single bulb that swung gently from a frayed cord. The concrete floor was stained with years of spilled oil and older secrets. Lieutenant Brody Kane stood in the center of the room with his hands on his hips, chest rising and falling with a slow, controlled fury. Captain Vance Keller emerged from the shadows, older, thinner, cough lingering beneath his breath, but still carrying the authority of a man who had once trained half the department to follow orders without blinking. Kane didn't turn when Keller approached. He didn't have to. They had known each other too long for introductions. Keller stopped beside him and said, "You kicked the nest." His tone wasn't angry. It was resigned, a man already counting consequences. Kane stared at the wall of boxed evidence and answered quietly, "He pushed me." Keller shook his head. "No, you pushed yourself, and now we burn the nest before it hatches." The words carried an old hardness, sharpened by fear and the kind of loyalty that had turned into something darker over the years. Keller opened one of the boxes with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside were files from cases long closed, cases he had shielded, curated, rewritten. "Listen to me," he said, his voice scratching through damaged lungs. "You showed your hand twice. Cameras caught the second one. The judge won't let it go. That reporter is sniffing around, and someone put our work in the wrong hands." Kane clenched his jaw. "I didn't give her anything." Keller gave him a long, measuring look. "I know you didn't, but someone did, which means we have a leak, and the only way to survive a leak is to drown it." He handed Kane a folder. Inside was the service record of a young officer who had died 2 years earlier during a traffic stop gone wrong. He didn't have family. No one left to ask questions. Keller tapped the folder again. He takes the weight, all of it, every altered report, every bad file, every ghost we've collected these years. Kane exhaled slowly. We're framing a dead cop. Keller's eyes hardened. We're preserving the department, the city, and you. There's a difference. There wasn't. But Kane let the lie settle. It made the situation easier to swallow. Outside the garage, the night carried its own silence, a silence that moved through Port Augustine like a warning. Judge Hale sat in chambers, reviewing the original reports Theo had placed in front of him. The more he read, the heavier the pages felt. Each report wasn't just evidence of wrongdoing. It was evidence of a system built to protect itself at the expense of the very people it claimed to serve. He rubbed his temple and exhaled. He had known police misconduct. He had judged cases shaped by bias. He had heard testimony twisted by fear or resentment. But this, many meticulously altered reports, was infrastructure, organized, sustained, intentional. The kind of wrongdoing that didn't live in shadows. It lived at desks, under signatures, in briefings spoken out loud. And somewhere in the city, someone else already knew what came next. That evening, as Judge Hale prepared a judicial order that would require the release of additional records, his daughter was walking across campus at her university in the Northeast. She laughed with friends near the library entrance, unaware that a camera far away had just printed her image on glossy paper. An envelope slid under the judge's door. Inside were 3 photos of her walking across the quad, smile bright, backpack slung over one shoulder, and a note written in thick black marker. Don't make her come home early. Nothing more. No signature, no demand. Just a reminder that Kane and Keller were willing to reach as far as necessary. Hale stood very still. He stared at the photographs, his heartbeat steadying into something quiet and lethal. He read the note a second time, then a third, before folding it back into the envelope with slow, controlled movements. He did not call security. He did not call the police. He did not call his daughter. Instead, he locked the envelope in his desk drawer and continued drafting the judicial order with the same deliberate handwriting he had used his entire career. It was not bravery. It was principle. The kind that made men stubborn enough to hold their ground when retreat seemed reasonable. Across town, the night delivered its violence with cold precision. Lena Vargas left the newsroom late, carrying a laptop bag filled with files she had not yet dared to print. She drove with the windows cracked, letting the cool air settle her nerves. The streets were quiet. No headlights behind her for the last 2 blocks. She turned onto the avenue leading toward her apartment. That was when she saw it, a pair of headlights appearing in her rear-view mirror too quickly, too suddenly, too close. She tightened her grip on the wheel. The SUV accelerated. She barely had time to brace before it slammed into her rear bumper with a brutal jolt. Her body snapped forward. The car spun slightly. She hit the curb. The SUV reversed, angled itself, and rammed her again, harder. She tasted blood. Her vision blurred. The laptop bag flew to the floorboard before she could gather herself. The SUV sped off, disappearing into the dark with no plate visible. No sound except the hollow echo of the impact. Lena crawled out of the car, gripping her stomach instinctively. Pain crashed through her in waves, sharp, deep, immediate. She collapsed onto the sidewalk, fighting to stay conscious long enough to dial 911. She didn't remember the ambulance. She didn't remember arriving at the emergency room. She remembered only a single moment, waking to the soft overhead light, a nurse's calm hands, and a doctor's quiet voice telling her she had lost the baby. She closed her eyes, the grief settling into her like a cold stone. She whispered, "Please don't say anything. Please." And the nurse nodded, sealing the secret in the sterile silence of the room. Meanwhile, in the garage, Kane stared at Keller. "The judge knows too much," he said. "The reporter knows too much, and the clerk is digging." Keller coughed into a handkerchief, breath rattling. "Then we handle them one at a time, quietly." He wiped his mouth and added, "This isn't about the slap anymore. It's about survival." Kane nodded, but something inside him trembled. Fear, pride, rage. He couldn't tell. Keller rested a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You wanted a war, son. You just started one." And somewhere in Port Augustine, a truth heavier than all their threats was already beginning to rise. The hearing Judge Darius Hale scheduled was not a hearing at all. It was an earthquake wrapped in legal procedure, broadcast live on every network, willing to risk the anger of Port Augustine's police union. A line curled around the courthouse steps, parents holding photographs, teenagers carrying silent signs, reporters adjusting microphones with the nervous energy of people who sensed history tremoring beneath their feet. Inside courtroom 3, the air felt charged in a way no room should feel before a public proceeding. The slap, the threats, the files, the car crash, all of it had pushed the city toward a single moment, and Hale understood the gravity of what he was about to do. He walked to the bench with measured steps, his robe hanging straight, his expression calm, but carved with resolve. When he struck the gavel once, a hush cloaked the room. This hearing will address procedural integrity within sworn testimony, the handling of evidence, and the integrity of many reports filed over nearly a decade, he said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Truth carries its own thunder. Theo Ramirez sat at the front, a stack of folders beside him that looked impossibly heavy for a man his age. He had slept only briefly, haunted by the faces inside those reports. Bruised children, trembling men, women whose statements had been rewritten until they no longer resembled their own voices. When the judge called him forward, Theo stood with a quiet steadiness that belied the storm inside him. He approached the bench and placed each original report on the wood, one by one, forming a stack that rose like a monument to everything the city had refused to see. The camera zoomed in. The gallery leaned forward. Theo laid his hand on top of the stack and said, "These are the originals, Your Honor. Not the versions approved for court." He opened the first file. "This one describes a compliant subject. The official version calls him hostile." He opened another. "This boy showed no aggression. The approved version says he attacked the officer." Another. "This woman begged for help. The approved version says she resisted arrest." Every page he read pressed deeper into the room, like stones piling on a single truth. None of this had been accidental. Judge Hale nodded for him to continue. Theo lifted his eyes, his voice tightening. "My father took his life because he was asked to sign a false report. When he refused, they buried him under paperwork until he broke." A ripple of emotion moved through the gallery. Theo inhaled, steadying himself. "I didn't know until last night that the report he refused to sign was part of this pattern." He placed the final file on the bench. "I submit these originals to the court." Hale accepted them with a solemn nod, his expression softening with the weight of Theo's truth. The room held its breath as Elena Cole, a woman whose story the city had buried, rose from the gallery. She walked with the slow, deliberate steps of someone carrying grief that had never been given a place to rest. In her hands was her son's old T-shirt, sealed in a plastic evidence sleeve, the blood still visible after all these years. She stepped toward the bench, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "My boy Darius," she said quietly, "was 16. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He didn't do anything wrong." The room fell silent as she unsealed the plastic, opened the shirt carefully, and laid it across the wood of the judge's bench like an offering. Her voice trembled. "I just wanted him to wear it to school the next morning." The sound that followed wasn't a sob. It was the deep, wounded inhale of a mother who had waited nearly a decade for someone to hear her. Even the cameras paused their mechanical whirring, as if the technology itself had bowed its head. Judge Hale leaned forward with gentle hands, giving her the respect her own city had denied her. He didn't speak. He didn't offer comfort that couldn't meet the depth of her pain. He let the moment breathe, letting her grief fill the room in a way truth often must before justice can begin. When she stepped back, several people in the gallery wiped tears from their eyes. Even the bailiffs shifted, their stoic expressions cracking at the sight of a shirt that had waited too long for daylight. Then came the moment everyone feared. The sergeant escorted Lieutenant Brody Kane into the courtroom. Cameras snapped. Reporters leaned forward. Kane walked with stiff shoulders and an expression carved from stone. But something in his eyes had changed. Not fear, not regret, but the sharp awareness of a man who finally realized the ground beneath him had given way. He sat at the defense table, hands clasped, jaw tight. Hale looked at him steadily, not with anger, but with a clarity that cut deeper. "Lieutenant Kane," he said, "you may remain silent, but the record will speak." Kane didn't lift his gaze. For the first time in his life, the badge on his chest didn't shield him. The room he once believed he controlled now felt like a place he had never truly understood. Lena Vargas sat in the press row, bandaged ribs aching beneath her blouse, her recorder glowing with that steady red light that had captured so many lies over the years. She had come straight from the hospital, her grief tucked beneath her composure, her loss hidden behind a steady journalistic posture. She watched Kane closely. She watched Keller's empty seat even more closely. She knew the SUV wasn't a coincidence. She knew someone wanted the truth buried. But sitting here, watching these files pile higher, watching a mother's grief touch corners of the room that law books never could, she felt something stir inside her. Resolve sharper and stronger than the fear that had marked her nights for weeks. Judge Hale looked over the room, letting the silence settle. "These reports," he said, tapping the stack with a firm hand, "represent not only misconduct, but a deliberate pattern of falsification that harmed families, destroyed trust, and cost a young man his life." His voice deepened. "Today, this ends." He didn't raise his volume. He didn't need to. The gravity in his tone wrapped the room like a final verdict. The camera zoomed on Kane. His jaw twitched. His hands tightened for the first time since anyone in that courtroom had known him. Brody Kane could not lift his eyes. He stared at the table, shoulders rigid, breathing shallow. The room saw it. The collapse, the crumbling of a man whose authority had been built on fear, not justice. Lena leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet as she whispered for her recorder. The reckoning begins. And it did, because the truth was no longer in the shadows. It was stacked on the judge's bench. It was soaked into a mother's shirt. It was carried in the trembling voice of a young clerk who refused to be silent. It was etched into a judge's bruised cheek. And as the people of Port Augustine watched the hearing unfold across televisions and phone screens, a realization settled over the city like a slow dawn. The cost of silence had finally become too high. In courtroom 3, the first cracks of justice rang louder than any slap ever could. The fall of Brody Kane did not begin in a courtroom or on the news. It began in the quiet of a garage where Captain Vance Keller stood alone beside his old workbench, hands trembling as he folded a single sheet of lined paper into thirds. His service pistol rested beside him. The air tasted of gasoline and dust, and every breath rattled inside lungs that had been failing for months. He had trained Kane. He had protected him. He had built the walls that hid nearly a decade of altered reports, buried complaints, and rewritten truths. And now the walls were collapsing. He could feel it in his bones. He pressed his thumb against the folded note, a note that read only, "I kept this city safe the only way I knew. I'm tired." No explanations, no defense, no mention of the children hurt or the mothers left grieving. Just that one thin confession. He placed the note on the workbench, lifted the pistol with steadying hands, closed his eyes, and exhaled a breath that sounded like surrender. A single shot echoed through the neighborhood. It was loud enough for the neighbors to hear, but not loud enough to summon forgiveness. The next morning, the city learned of Keller's death before it learned anything else. The press called it a tragedy. The department called it a loss. But the people of Port Augustine understood what it really was, a crack in the shield that had protected men like him for too long. Lena Vargas read the news alert from her kitchen table, hand resting over the bandage beneath her blouse. She did not celebrate. She did not grieve. She simply whispered, "One down," before turning her attention back to the stack of files spread across her desk. Theo read the news from his apartment and felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. Not for Keller, but for every family who never got the chance to hear the truth from him while he was still alive. Judge Darius Hale read the news in chambers and closed his eyes, not with sorrow, but with the somber understanding that men like Keller rarely died for the right reasons. They died for fear of exposure, not for remorse. Inside the courthouse, the federal indictment moved faster than anyone expected. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed charges against Lieutenant Kane within days. Many counts, civil rights violations, evidence tampering, falsifying reports, assault on a judge, obstruction, patterns of brutality. It was a list long enough to fill 2 pages. Kane was arrested at dawn, pulled from his home, still wearing his undershirt, his face pale with disbelief, his teenage son refusing to come down the stairs to watch. The cameras captured every second of it. Kane escorted down his driveway in handcuffs, jaw clenched, shoulders squared but trembling. Reporters shouted questions he refused to answer. His neighbors watched from behind curtains. His son watched from the darkened hallway inside, silent and stone-faced. The trial moved to federal court, where the ceiling lights hummed quietly above a room full of people who had waited years for this moment. Kane sat between 2 attorneys, posture rigid, expression locked into something cold and empty. He avoided the cameras. He avoided the gallery most of all. He avoided looking at the bench where Judge Hale sat, not presiding, but observing from the back row, his black robe replaced by a plain dark suit. He was there as a victim, as a witness, as a man who had been slapped twice in front of a room full of people but refused to bow. The prosecution moved methodically. They showed the original reports. They showed the altered versions. They showed photographs of bruised children, broken wrists, frightened teenagers whose stories had been twisted into weapons against them. They played audio. They introduced testimony from officers who had once admired Kane, but now trembled as they admitted the truth under oath. Lena took the stand, her voice steady despite the lingering pain in her ribs. She recounted the envelope, the files, the car crash. Theo testified next, telling the court about his father, about the night he found the original Darius Cole report in the basement, about the weight he felt carrying it in his hands. When Kane took the stand, his voice was flat, empty, stripped of the confidence he once wore like armor. He denied altering the reports. He denied knowing who did. He denied responsibility for anything. But the jury saw the patterns. They saw the evidence. They saw the rage he had shown in courtroom 3. They saw the slap. They saw Keller's note. When the verdict finally came, it landed like a stone dropped in still water. A lengthy federal prison sentence. No chance of parole. The maximum sentence allowed under the law. The courtroom did not cheer. The city did not erupt. Justice, when it finally arrives after years of silence, does not bring celebration. It brings breath. It brings release. It brings the quiet acknowledgement that something dark has ended, even if something broken still remains. Kane's fall did not end in the courtroom. It continued inside the walls of the federal penitentiary, where he arrived weeks later. Word of his conviction spread through the cell blocks before he even stepped through intake. Men he had once arrested watched him with a hunger sharpened by memory. During his early weeks in prison, several inmates cornered him. They beat him until the guards intervened. Broken ribs and a fractured eye socket, marking the price he had spent years inflicting on others. He survived, but barely. The warden placed him in protective custody, not for his safety, but because too many inmates had lined up for their turn. And then came the moment that broke him in a way even the trial had not. His teenage son, once proud to carry the Kane name, appeared on a live stream outside the courthouse, standing with his mother. Cameras watched as the boy dropped his father's old police shield into a courthouse trash can. The metal clattered against the plastic in a way that felt like an ending. "I'm done with him," the boy said quietly. "I don't want his name anymore." The clip spread across the city in minutes. It spread across the country in hours. It was the kind of moment that carved itself into memory. The kind of moment that reminded people that justice costs everyone something, even the innocent caught in the orbit of the guilty. Lieutenant Brody Kane had once believed he was the man who held the city together. Now he existed behind concrete walls, behind steel bars, behind a reality he had built with his own hands. And the city he once controlled no longer spoke his name with fear. It spoke it with clarity, as a cautionary tale, as a reminder of the cost of unchecked power, as a chapter in a story that was not yet finished. The fall was complete, and Port Augustine, for the first time in nearly a decade, felt the ground beneath it begin to shift toward truth. Years passed before the echoes finally settled, though no one could say exactly when the shift occurred. Only that one morning the city woke up and realized the anger that had once burned across Port Augustine had cooled into something quieter, steadier, almost sacred. Courtroom 3 still looked the same wooden bench, the same worn railings, the same brass fixtures that had survived generations of arguments and verdicts. But the room carried a different kind of weight now, shaped by everything it had witnessed. Judge Darius Hale walked toward the bench with the calm purpose of a man who had learned to breathe through storms that would have shattered other men. His hair had grayed more in the last few years, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but his posture held the same steady dignity that had defined him since the first day he put on the robe. He had turned down the federal bench 3 times, not out of pride, but because this room, this city, these people needed him more than Washington ever could. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and began the morning docket with the same measured cadence that had carried Port Augustine through its darkest days. Outside, the courthouse square had become a place of quiet remembrance. Where once there were protests, now there was a bronze sculpture, a single open hand, palm lifted gently toward the sky. No face, no figure, no elaborate plaque, just one line engraved at the base. Some fights are won by never raising a fist. The hand was not a monument to Kane or Keller or even Hale himself. It was a reminder of restraint in the face of violence, of courage that chooses integrity over force. Each year on the anniversary of the day, the files were revealed to the public. The people of Port Augustine arrived without speeches or banners, without cameras or reporters. They came with a single white lily each, laying them at the bee of the bronze palm in a soft circle of memory. Parents brought their children. Elders stood with bowed heads. Some stayed only long enough to set down the flower. Others stayed until sunset, letting the silence do what words could not. The city had been wounded. The city had healed. And this ritual, simple, solemn, unadvertised, kept the truth alive. Lena Vargas walked across the square one afternoon with a stroller in front of her, moving slowly, savoring the softness of the breeze. The child inside kicked his legs gently, staring up at the bronze hand with curious eyes that didn't yet understand the depth of the history beneath it. His name was Darius, a name chosen not out of grief, but out of honor. Lena rested her hand lightly on the stroller handle, her body still carrying the faint memory of old scars, her heart steadier now than it had been in years. She had not forgotten the night she lost her first child. She never would. But she had allowed her heart to open again, slowly, bravely, and this little boy was proof of that quiet courage. When she looked at him, she saw not replacement, but renewal. She whispered, "This city is different now." And the boy made a soft, gurgling sound, as if he agreed. She walked on, her steps light. Near the courthouse entrance, Theo Ramirez emerged wearing a tailored suit, a leather case under his arm. He had become a prosecutor, not because he wanted power, but because he wanted accountability. The kind of accountability his father never found in time. He paused at the top of the steps, watching the square with the reflective gaze of someone who had seen both the best and worst of a city up close. Sometimes when he handled cases involving excessive force or falsified reports, he still felt the echo of that basement room, the cold metal shelves, the dusty boxes, the moment he opened the Darius Cole file and saw his father's handwriting trembling across the margin. But now, instead of fear, he felt purpose. His father's story no longer haunted him. It guided him. He walked down the steps with quiet confidence, nodding to familiar faces who remembered him as the young clerk who carried the truth into courtroom 3 that day. As the years settled, the city did not forget what had happened. Instead, it learned to carry the memory with dignity. The West Side, once shaped by fear and resentment, began to breathe easier. New training programs appeared in the department. Transparency committees were formed. Civilian oversight grew teeth. Officers who once walked their beats with unchecked power now worked under a system that demanded honesty, not intimidation. It wasn't perfect. No city ever is. But the direction had changed. The people felt it. The courts felt it. Even the police department felt it, reshaped under leadership that had learned from the seat of the past. In his chambers, Judge Hale sometimes opened the drawer where he kept the old envelope, the one with the photographs of his daughter and the threat that had tried to silence him. The pictures had faded slightly, the edges yellowing, the ink softening, but he kept them as a reminder. Not of fear. The fear had long since burned away, but of the moment he realized that integrity carried a cost he was willing to pay. He never showed the photos to anyone. He never told his daughter. He simply let them sit in that drawer like a folded piece of history, a marker of the road he refused to abandon. Near sunset, the square grew quiet. A soft glow fell across the bronze palm, giving it the warm hue of living skin. A few people lingered. A retired teacher who had testified during the hearings. A teenager who once feared the police but now considered becoming one. A mother who brought lilies every year without fail. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Silence had become its own language here, a language the city had earned. Judge Hale stepped outside after finishing his docket, pausing at the edge of the square. He watched the people, the lilies, the bronze hand reaching upward as if offering the light back to the sky. He breathed in slowly. The weight he carried was still there, but it no longer pressed him downward. It steadied him. He walked toward the sculpture and stood for a moment, listening to the quiet. The kind of quiet that comes only after a long fight. The kind that signals not defeat, but peace. He touched the edge of the pedestal and whispered, "We're still here." Then he turned and walked back toward the courthouse, the robe moving around him like a shadow. Behind him, the lilies remained, a circle of white resting beneath a bronze promise. And Port Augustin breathed a little easier, held a little steadier, healed a little deeper. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence that finally, mercifully, heals. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If you'd like to hear more powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Give the video a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support truly helps.